Hello, hello, hello. Hello, good evening, everybody. It's really lovely to see you. We want to start on time, so we know we might have one or two stragglers, but it's all right. We're just going to get going. Welcome to the first ever Saturday of the first ever St Andrew's Book Festival in London. So pat yourselves on the back for finding us and finding out about us, because it's greatly appreciated. I'm not going to talk any longer. I just want to tell you that when we were programming the festival, we invited 5 debut authors, 5 people bringing out the first books. And then, much to our absolute astonishment, discovered all 5 happened to be nominees for the Saltire First Book Award, which for us was absolutely thrilling. To add to that, one of them is here tonight, and she's the winner of the Saltire First Book Award. Please welcome Gavin Esler with Jen Stout. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and a warm welcome from me to the first ever St Andrew's Book Festival, brought to you by Scots in London. And I have to say they have done an immensely entertaining, wonderful job. So thank you to all the organisers. It's always difficult to get something off the ground, and you've done it, and you're flying. Thank you. And Jen has joined me here, and this was going to be, I think, a fascinating insight into the war, which is more or less on our doorstep, unfortunately. Our format is very simple. I'm just going to introduce Jen. Congratulations, by the way, on the Saltire. That is amazing. And she's going to talk about her remarkable book. She'll talk about the method, the stories, the impressions of the extraordinary people she met in Ukraine. And we'll have then a conversation, and then I'll throw it open to some questions, and that'll take us up to the hour. So please will you welcome Jen Stout.
Thank you very much. I'm sitting so far away so I can just glance at my slides. It's not because I don't like Gavin. It's really nice to be here. I think especially nice that, as you may know, St Andrew is the patron saint of Ukraine as well. So it feels particularly appropriate to be here. I'm gonna run through just the story of the book, how I ended up where I did, and then we'll have a chat, and then we'll have a Q&A. So the backstory I will not go on and on about, but how did I end up going from Shetland to Russia is largely down to one woman called Marian Ockenden, who is my high school Russian teacher, because you could study Russian in Scotland at that time, which you can no longer do, which is a great shame. Because I'd done German, I'd done French, and I really didn't get on with them, and didn't get on with school very much, actually. And then this one teacher just changed my life, partly by being encouraging and taking the time, you know. And Russian it was like I spoke it in a past life. So I spent a long time trying to get to Russia, and that was difficult. It took me a long time. I finally got on this fellowship. I'd been working at the BBC, and I abruptly left and went to Moscow, but it was November 2021. So it was far too late to be doing any kind of idealistic journalism. I had wanted to go and work at Novaya Gazeta, the last investigative independent newspaper, because my teenage hero was Anna Politkovskaya, who of course was murdered probably by the Russian state in 2006. And I read about her life, I read her work, and I thought, that's what I want to do for some reason. So I did get to Moscow. And this was just before the invasion. So I was in Moscow for a couple of months. I was studying, and it was very, very surreal, like extremely surreal, because everyone around us, we were reading the Western news. Most people around us were not, and did not believe the hype, thought we were reading too much CNN and we should just give it a rest. And if you remember at that time, the US and British intelligence agencies had taken that, I think, unprecedented step of just saying, we know what you're going to do, it's this. And I remember there was a lot of debate of people saying, well, they're just stirring things up, you know. But what the hell did we think they were doing with 120,000 troops on that border around Kharkiv, around Kiev? When I look back at it now, it seems obvious, but it wasn't at the time. I thought it would just be an incursion into Donbass maybe. I didn't think that Russia would actually do a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, not because I think the Russian government is very nice, but because I thought they weren't stupid. But anyway, we know what happened. So the 24th of February, I was actually in Siberia, which was unfortunate, and I just landed in Siberia, right at the heart of the continent, and had to leave very quickly, although it took us 4 days for the programme to be cancelled. But at that time, then all the airspace shut down to planes from Russia, and Turkey was the only route that you could go. So off to Turkey I went. This was about 28th of February. And my whole mind was just totally consumed with my friends in Kharkiv especially. So I've been to Ukraine a few years before, and I've been in contact with them a lot. And you can see how close Kharkiv is to the Russian border. And you remember probably those first days of the invasion and early days of March. The aerial bombardment of that beautiful city was just relentless. It was just extraordinary. I remember Quentin Somerville was doing a live from there, and he's walking down this completely ravaged street, and he says, if this doesn't look familiar to you, you've not been paying attention, because it's the same warplanes and the same generals that had done that to Aleppo and to Grozny. Raise everything. And that's what they were trying to do. And I thought I would go there, as you do. So first I went to Romania to report on the border, and it was actually a place I'd never really knew nothing about, and I just landed in such luck because Romania is an incredible country, and particularly this part of Romania. So the Danube forms the border between there and Ukraine, and the barge that crosses it is where people were coming across. The Danube's about a mile. It's just before it becomes the Delta, which I'd read about because it's UNESCO. It's very beautiful. And I landed up there with really no idea what I was doing. I mean, I could speak Russian. I was trained as a journalist, had lots of experience, but obviously I hadn't covered a war before. And I had a lot of people saying, well, you know, it's very reckless and selfish, and you shouldn't go off and do this because you don't have enough experience, which is always a conundrum I find quite funny. Like, how does one get the experience without first going to do the thing? Anyway, not everyone said that. I was in Romania for a few weeks, really, I mean, relying on the kindness of the volunteers I met who said, oh, do you need somewhere to stay? And I said, yes. And they said, what's your budget? And I said, nothing. And they said, oh, we've got this boat repair workshop and you can sleep upstairs. There's a little room, and I would eat food in the canteen, and it was just, it was lovely. And every day I was going here, which was this barge, as I mentioned, coming across the Danube. I think at this time there were several thousand people crossing every day. The barge went day and night. It didn't really stop. And it should have been warmer. It was unseasonably cold. And so all these poor little kids and old folk were wrapped up. And you see a lot of them like really don't have much luggage at all. They might have left from Odesa, from Mykolaiv, but there were people from Mariupol coming through that port. And what they had escaped from, I mean, was just utter hell, the stories that people were telling you. But even just living in Odesa, watching, people would describe or show me on their phones. Imagine you're looking at the horizon and this ship turns up, guns bristling, and they're all pointed at you. And that was enough to convince a lot of them to leave. And then the air raid sirens, and there had been bombings. And they were really met with a huge amount of kindness. And I think that was one of the most moving things, is that Ukrainians, a lot of folk, you know, they weren't well off, some of them, and they hadn't left Ukraine before, and they didn't know what kind of reception they were going to get. Particularly in that region, you know, there's not exactly an easy history between Romania and Ukraine, if you go back to World War II. And they were met with such kindness, and that was when people would start to cry, actually, because they were so surprised. Does anyone remember this from the news? Deti is the sign that people tape to their cars, and it means children. In the hope that a Russian tank or a sniper wouldn't shoot at them if it said that there were kids in the car. And it was often a vain hope. And I remember, I've been working at the port for a couple of weeks, and I was there pretty much every day just chatting to people, and I was writing for the Sunday Post and LRB. And, you know, like it's a difficult thing. I mean, you know, like you have to maintain a certain amount of distance. You can't sort of be fully emotionally into it. But sometimes things just get you. And I remember taking this picture, and just the sheer fact of this flimsy little bit of paper taped to the back of a car, the idea of having to do that, and I just burst into tears and had to run away because I was really embarrassed. There were lots and lots of little kids, lots of older folk, no younger men because they're not allowed to leave under martial law. And some people knew where they were going, maybe they had relatives in the West, and a lot of people had absolutely no idea. It was just down to the sort of mishmash you can see here of charities and a bit of government stuff and a bit of EU stuff. So, I mean, it was remarkably well organised, actually, at that crossing. I spent a few weeks, and then I went to Odesa, and this was the Odesa that I found. Now, I had dreamed of going to Odesa like all my life, and I used to sit in Shetland when I was stuck there very miserably, and I would go on Google Street View and sort of walk around the streets of Odesa, thinking, one day I'll go there. So to be honest, when I did get there, I was so happy. I just couldn't believe that I could be there, even in such terrible times. This is the very famous Deribavskaya, and these are the anti-tank hedgehogs, they call them, the Yoji. At the time, it was thought that Odesa could be taken by, if they broke through at Mykolaiv, if they came from the Black Sea, and those Transnistrian troops that Russia still has could be mobilized. None of that happened, thankfully, and still hasn't, but the city was very, very preparing for siege. And they were very, more so than any other city that I was in, actually, very angsty about who you were and what you were doing, and that's because the FSB, has long had a deep infiltration in Ukrainian society, but particularly in Odesa. So I was stopped a lot and asked what the hell I was doing, which is fair enough. One of these pictures is from World War II. I just still find this extraordinary. And it really, there are so many echoes of the 1930s, of the 1940s in what was happening then and what is happening now with appeasement. And really everything I saw in Ukraine, jackbooted soldiers going house to house to search houses for evidence of people being Nazis, and the evidence would be like a book in Ukrainian or a blue and yellow flag. And then they'd haul them away, torture them and shoot them and leave them on the side of the road. That's what happens under Russian occupation. And the 1930s were not long ago. There's also a very, very keen sense of humour in this city, as there is all across Ukraine. And I think one of the few bright spots of that time was the world getting to know Ukrainian humour, which is excellent, very sarcastic. And this is like Mama is the nickname for Odesa, and it's like, if anyone touches her, then she'll drown them, which is a reference, that little sinking boat is a reference to that big, the cruiser that I mentioned with the bristling guns pointing straight at the city. They managed to sink it with a Neptune missile, which no one really still understands how they did. And people were very happy about it, because that was a massive threat to the city. And it also had roused a lot of emotion. So one of the stories I tell in the book is about, I ended up at a birthday party on the first day in Odesa. I'd got there on a military convoy, and I got to this party with Larissa. She was a friend of a friend, and it was like, there's lots and lots of kids running around, and there was a bird in a corner, like in a cage, and just not what, you've prepared yourself to go into a war zone, and suddenly there's all these old women being like, have some more zakuski, and she started crying and had this big fight with some of the young men because she was not pro-Russian, I must stress this, nostalgic for Soviet times, which a lot of older people are, nostalgic for when they could still believe in the idea of the brotherly nation, the big brother. And they're not stupid. They know where the rockets are coming from. They know they're coming from the big brother, but they want to hold on to that idea. And so when the cruiser, the Moskva, was sunk, and she said to me, you wouldn't believe it, people were clapping, but those were boys, and she nearly said, our boys on that ship. And it just was a little vignette of like the everyday interactions, the shifting loyalties, and the kind of psychological knots that people are tying themselves in when everything that they've believed in for decades and decades is suddenly literally blown up. There's lots of normal life as well. There's millions of people, of course, and you have to go to the market and you have to buy your sauerkraut and your fermented pickles and fermented apples. I spent a long time with these guys because I'm really into fermenting, so we had some great chat. This is the Privoz market, and this was a rocket strike on Easter weekend, straight through a block. I suspect it might have been an air defense rocket shot down, but it's still Russia that sent it there. And it had killed, there was 3 generations of the same family, a little baby girl and her mother and her grandmother, who were all killed in the same flat. They'd hid in the bathroom, as is the advice, but it had not saved them. This is a man in the remains of his flat. So I was able to go there sort of straight after the explosions happened and just be there, be on the ground, talk to people, take pictures, and send it all to the Sunday Post. And I think it was one of those times where I really thought, like, there's a reason for me being here, because we don't have any foreign correspondents left in Scotland, almost none. It's like me and David Pratt, and we're freelance, and Quentin at the BBC. We used to have, the oldest and greatest newspapers in the world, and we have no one covering a major war in Scotland. We're just getting agency copy. And so then the Sunday Post held the front page, and I was filing quite late at night, and they could put on the front page of the newspaper, our correspondent in Odesa. And I think that really, really matters. I still think that's important. I also interviewed people at bases. These were mostly volunteers. There have been like queues and queues of people signing up for the Territorial Army in particular in the beginning. They didn't have enough weapons for them or anything, frankly, but they were all very idealistic and not naive about what they were facing, I'd say. Down in Mykolaiv, a lovely little, it's actually twinned with Glasgow now. It's a port shipbuilding port. And this is what they've been doing to it. So this is aerial bombardment in just a wee bit with like crofts almost, like wee houses, and people have like grapes and cows and stuff. And then this. You can see people like planted all their spring onions. And actually there were still some people living in these places because they just didn't feel that they could leave, they didn't have the resources, and they'd be tending their spring onions next to a bomb crater, which might seem crazy, but like, it isn't really. Going to Mykolaiv, I'd had lots of people say, just as when I went to Odessa, there's always a more dangerous place, and people would say, oh, you can't go to Mykolaiv, it's far too dangerous. And then you go there, and you're to go and interview, as a journalist, your job is to go and annoy people on a nice afternoon while they're playing chess. And these two old lads, are sort of very apologetically saying, oh, so how is life at the moment? And they just looked at me and laughed and said, oh, we're fine. And it's very idyllic, right? It's very idyllic. There was an air raid siren at the time, people are ignoring it. And you do that because you can't spend your whole life underground. But having said that, this is Chestnut Square, and it was bombed, I'd say about 3 months after that. And yeah, I think I took this because it was so lovely there once, right? Look at all those wee tulips that somebody's planted so fastidiously, and the grapevines because it's down on the Black Sea. It's warm weather. It had been a really, really lovely place. After a few weeks, I again was told that I couldn't possibly go to Kharkiv because it was too dangerous. Or people would, people get very melodramatic and they would say things like, you can't go to Kharkiv because it's been wiped off the map, and I'd say, actually, there's a train every night, so just get the train, shall I? And look, it was more dangerous. I'm being slightly facetious, but everywhere's more dangerous than somewhere else, Kharkiv was a city that I knew really well, and my friends were mostly still there. They hadn't left. They were helping the army and helping civilians, baking bread and delivering food around the city. So off I went on the, 20-hour night train from Odessa to Kharkiv. At the time, the red of the Russian forces had been pushed back quite a bit. So previously in March, this was sort of late April, and previously they'd been right outside the city, and so they were able to they were so close that they could just throw artillery shells into the high-rises. They were still actually doing that when I was there. So it was very painful to see a city that I love so much. The architecture of Kharkiv is crazy. It's so beautiful. There's so many different styles. Like, you can see so much history just by looking at the layers of different buildings. And this was on Big Freedom Square, one of the biggest in Europe, the kind of council HQ, regional council, which they'd hit with a rocket on the 3rd of March. But not very well. They kind of missed. So that's the journalist David Patrikarakos and Alexei in the basement. And you can see the scorch marks there. It was sort of, I'd seen it, actually, I was in Vienna airport standing next to a Ukrainian woman, and she showed me this video on her phone. She was from Kharkiv. She was trying to go home, and the whole building just being engulfed in fire. And I think I said something very rude in the sort of polite environs of an Austrian airport. But it was shocking, but well built. So now they're fixing it up. They are also now fixing this up. This used to be trade union houses, and now, well, before this was done to it in March 22, it was a lovely sort of hipster hangout with like you could buy records and have a very nice coffee. They have really, really good coffee in Ukraine. No reason at all why it would be targeted by a £1,000 aerial bomb, but there we go. Nursery school, again. I think, as Quentin had pointed out in that package, the point was terror. The point is terror. This is Saltivka, the northern districts, which are kind of, if you have in your mind an idea of like very monolithic Soviet blocks, and it's the kind of like big dormitory districts that we might think, oh God, that's so grey and so grim. People loved it. It was really green. Like, look at all the trees, and there's a play park everywhere, and there was loads of metro stops and tram stops. Like, it was a really nice place to live. You can see this is still smoking actually from the strike, because it was just almost constant what was being done to that place. And there were still people there trying to live like in the basements like this, Yulia and Misha. That was just outside their house. Misha was 8 at the time. Sometimes he goes away to Moldova to see his granny, but largely he's living in Kharkiv and spends all his time with his mum, which she says is not good for him. And the kids they're not learning to socialize enough. There are some kids going back to school in Kharkiv, and that's because they have built underground primary schools, which is one of the most depressing sentences you can think of. At the time, people were sheltering in the metro, and I mean living in the metro, because it was the safest place to be, inside the trains as well. And they had everything down there, man, like pot plants, cats, you know, the works. It's also where I met these old women who would sort of say, "Oh, Solnishka," like my little sunshine. What are you doing here? Isn't your flak jacket too heavy for you? And what, isn't your granny worried about you? And it was like, it's being constantly dressed down, because I'm meant to be asking how they are, like worrying about me. Outside Kharkiv, the villages had been occupied for several weeks by the Russians, and they'd done what the Russians tend to do in occupation, which is terrorize and execute people. This was one of their tanks. And there had been very, very fierce battles all around. I mean, a lot of people had died in that spot, and they'd cleared most of the bodies, but there was a helicopter the wreckage of a helicopter just over the hill. And there were some people left, but they were, horribly traumatized, really. This had been a high school in Vilhivka, the gym hall with the nose of artillery there. And this was the kind of example of what I was writing this all up as. So this was in the Sunday Post, again, which were an excellent, excellent newspaper who take the time and money to commission people on the ground and have foreign reporting. Some of the people I interviewed in Vilhivka, because I'd heard kind of people whispering about those who didn't come back after the Russians left, when they were pushed out, and it transpired that they had deported a whole bunch of people by tricking them into big trucks, telling them that it was for their safety, and then taking them straight over the border to Russia, which of course is a war crime. In Kharkiv itself, the people who were left were spending all their time raising money for the army in concerts like this that were being live streamed, and it was really it was the atmosphere of like Sandy Bells in Edinburgh crossed with like the East London Scots when they still existed, you know. It was great. And it made me, like, I really had to think about it a lot at that time, because to me, the army, you know, when you're growing up here, had been this very distant thing that I would maybe have a kind of knee-jerk reaction to, because I would associate it with things I was against, like Iraq. And here, the army was that guy's brother, you know, relatives, friends and family, and they were fighting not very far away, and the only reason that we could go there and read poetry with Serhii Jadan and have a nice time, the only way we could do that freely is because they were fighting. And that was a kind of constant mantra, and still is, that they owe everything to those guys on the front line. And also at the time, they just didn't really have much kit, so they were fundraising so that somebody's dad might have night vision goggles when someone was shooting at them. So it really brought a lot of that home. And they were constantly fundraising for equipment. So this is my friend Ivana, who's a sort of powerhouse, and she managed to get this stuff. It's like a big, I don't know what the word would be, to find people under the rubble. And she got it from Finland, and it was like tens of thousands of pounds that she'd managed to fundraise. On later trips, I did reporting from more frontline positions, I suppose, once I'd done my hostile environment training. And this was a team of Kharkiv hipsters, I would say. Like, one of them had been a air steward, and you know, they're all in IT and very cool, and there they were suddenly going off to launch drone missions. The Starlink was completely essential. Obviously it became less so because Elon Musk decided he didn't want to help them, he wanted to sabotage them, but at the time setting that up at each position was really useful, because then you could have comms with the commanders. This woman I barely spoke to, because I've never seen anyone more completely focused on their task at hand. Her name is Vladislava Chernich, and she was killed 3 weeks later in Bakhmut. She was 28 years old. And that's the story I wrote about her. When she died, it was Christmas, actually. It was very strange, because I was in Fair Isle looking after 30 sheep and a dog, and but trying to also phone up a lot of her comrades to get an account of her and then publish this, and we did it on the front page of the Sunday Post, which I think really matters, that thousands of people could see her face and remember her. This is in Donbass, so I went on to Kramatorsk on various different trips, sometimes driving myself in my friend's tiny little car, and freelancing, doing radio, and not video, because who can do the faff, but radio and print mostly. And talking to some guy. This is a Scottish pickup truck. So I'd driven in one of the many, many convoys where they buy up pickup trucks from farms and drive them across Europe to the front line. One of the major flaws in that plan is that when you've got a pickup on a farm, you're only really driving it a few miles each day, and then you drive it 1,600 miles, and it will die in a kind of spectacular, like radiator exploding on the Polish motorway kind of way, which I've put in the book. But I love the idea that all across the front line it's just really useful for them to have a fast vehicle. All across the front line there's all these like right-hand drive things that come from us. I think that's really moving. I accidentally went to the wrong place, which is much more dangerous than a place I was meant to go. This is an evacuation of people from Sieviersk, a city which is still in Ukrainian hands. But I mean, life there is so, even then it was almost impossible. It was constant shelling, and they were trying to get people out. And two things got in the way. One was the mud, and one was the fact that people just didn't want to leave because often they had animals and livestock that they'd worked all their lives to get. And a lot of people would say, I can't leave because my parents are buried here and I can't leave their grave. But these guys were leaving. I remember this day because I'm not a photographer principally, and partly that's because I can't take pictures of people like this. I would often just step away and not take the picture because I felt really gross doing it. And it's important that photographers do this, but I'm glad it's not my primary job. There was so much shelling in Sieviersk that these were fresh graves dug of people who'd been killed by shelling outside the hospital, and then 2 minutes after I took this, then we heard the and had to run into the hospital and take shelter. I often travelled around. It was a very haphazard way, so I didn't have like a crew and a fixer and a team and a jeep. It was just me and the friends that I made, and this is some of the people from PEN Ukraine, so the Ukrainian chapter of PEN International, who do a kind of literary activism where they take books to the libraries that the Russians had destroyed. They deliver jeeps to the army, as they're doing here, and it was a great way for me to get around with not much money and go to places like Liman, which I would otherwise not have been allowed in. And this was what Liman looked like. I've never seen such devastation. Very few people left. This is a good reason why. That's also this is evidence of a war crime because that is a cassette cluster bomb. The lovely 1950s Soviet railway station there. Nearby, the churches had been bombed very heavily because their basements were holding a lot of people. So, of course, they were a target. I included this because I think this place is absolutely beautiful. This is the north of Donetsk region. It's a place that most people will associate with kind of post-Soviet grey industrial and now war. It's so beautiful. Look at these like chalk hills in the background, and that conical bit is it's like a shale bing, like we'd have in West Lothian, and it made me feel so like oh. And this kind of misty rolling forest. I mean, it's a gorgeous place, and I so hope to see it in peacetime. This is the memorial in Kiev for soldiers who have died, and you can see there's quite a lot of flags that are not Ukrainian, particularly Georgian, but quite a lot of Brits. And a bit of lightness, because the book is quite full of joy as well, dancing and beauty and music and bairns. And this was down in I heard someone playing the accordion. I got so excited in Kiev, and I went down into the metro, and there were all these lovely people just like waltzing around. And so I took this picture, and then I taught them the Shetland backstep. It's quite difficult. And we'll finish on this one. In this beautiful, beautiful European city. This is Maidan, where they had the Revolution of Dignity in 2012, 2013, and being punished ever since. And I think we'll finish there and hand over to a chat. Yeah.
Jen, thank you for
Thanks.
that. Thank you. I love the book, as I said to you before. What I loved most about it was what you've just touched on, which is the human faces and the human suffering and how humans get through this. Can I ask a couple of questions about you and how you were able to relate to them? Because am I right in thinking you went there only speaking Russian and English? Mm-hmm. And you said you did a bit of German and French, but now, do people in Ukraine who speak Ukrainian, do they look at you and think, who is this strange person who's coming to me speaking Russian, which is the language of the people invading us, or do they think we're bilingual in that language? I mean, how did that go down?
I think because I was in the south and the east of the country mostly, where people, by and large, speak Russian, because it is their native language and doesn't belong to Russia, then it was easier. But I think there's been a massive shift. So my friends in Kharkiv, I'd say when I was there in 2018, we would all talk in Russian, and now none of them will. Nobody will.
Really? They just refuse to speak it?
Yeah, for several reasons. One, it's actually just quite traumatic. So it's like a huge reckoning with your past and everything. You know, if you're growing up, you're brought up with this idea that Moscow is the pinnacle of civilization. All the books come from Moscow. The great Russian culture, the great Russian novel. And you really get imbibed with that, you know. And then you see it for what it is, and people would switch and just never go back. It's been a huge transformation, and I completely understand why people do. I completely understand. So yeah, I can understand Ukrainian, and I can say a few words. But by and large, people would speak Russian with me, not in Lviv, I'd say, not in the West. That would be deeply offensive.
Really?
Yes.
And you, because you were interested in Russia, you were in Russia when it started.
Yeah.
So how do you feel about that? Because, I mean, looking at the pictures, they could be Russian faces to me or from an outsider. I mean, couldn't they? And do you find, what did you find and what did you think of Russian people who are suffering in a different way, but this is a war of an invasion of their neighbours?
Maybe I'm a bit blunt about this. I have very little interest in us discussing the suffering of the Russian people. I think we focused on Russia for far too long at the expense of Ukrainian experiences. Yes, I did. You know, from a teenager, I was completely enthralled with this language, with the poetry, particularly. And there were many things that I loved about Russia. I liked the emotional directness. I liked the way that people, you know, I'm not very good at small talk, and they don't do that there. You just say exactly what you think. And yes, that's a sort of Eastern European trait. So, but none of those things really. The thing that sticks with me is the brainwashing. I don't have any other word for it. The way that, you know, some of my language teachers, they were like lovely women, you know, they were nice to me, but they would also come out with stuff that was just imperialist. And not just imperialist, you know, sort of how dare those Georgians shun the Russian language because we gave them access to the great Moscow universities, that sort of chauvinism stuff. Very kind of British Empire, we gave them the railways, you know. But also a disregard for human life. I mean, you can say life is cheap in Russia, and I think that's true in like the kind of conversations that people have, the way that people will refer to Ukrainians with sort of slurs and as if they're not people. That goes really, really deep, really deep. And you say, yeah, they could be similar, I guess, if you're looking at them. But one thing that they are very different cultures. And I think the best way to illustrate this is if you remember those videos that were coming out at the beginning of Russian soldiers who wanted to appeal to the authorities and say, we don't have enough food and we don't have enough ammunition. But they would do it in this very kind of craven way, right? But they'd all line up and they'd nominate a spokesperson, and he'd sort of with shaking hand appeal to the camera and say, dear Vladimir Vladimirovich, we don't seem to have any food. Sorry, could you fix this? In the you know, when he does his telethon and everybody phones up and says our town is really shit and can you fix it, and he does, and they're oh wonderful, thank you. And you saw the same actually with Kursk when the Ukrainians went into Kursk Oblast, and the civilians who'd all been left behind and not evacuated did the same kind of video. Dear Putin, you seem to have forgotten to evacuate us. We don't have any gas or any food. Please, could you? You would never catch a Ukrainian behaving in that way, in my experience. Like, they have a different conception of power and of the state. And the horizontal society, those networks of horizontalism of volunteers that sprang up, 2004, but particularly 2014, have kept that country going. And it's a kind of horizontalism that I've just never seen in Russia. So they are, and that goes back centuries. They are very, very different cultures.
I was very interested also in what you said about taking photographs and feeling slightly uncomfortable and not wanting to be in people's faces, literally. That is very, because this is their life, and it's not just a news story. And were you very conscious of that? This is somebody's life here, and I'm privileged to get to see a bit of it. How did you feel about that?
Yeah, I felt lucky all the time to be where I was and speaking to people. But it's being pushy about it, a lot of time people just didn't want to speak to journalists. They were sick of it. They were sick of their lives being picked over by all these Western journalists. And I think, like, I wouldn't want to talk ill of my esteemed colleagues, and almost everyone I met, journalists, were super. But there are a few times, there was people who were they were very grabby. And they would get people. I remember there was an Italian guy I was talking to this couple for ages, because I could talk to them. It's in Russian, it's fine. And they were staying behind, and they were really lovely. We had this long chat. And this guy had also taken his picture and put it in a big newspaper, and that's never happened to them before. And I saw him posting this, and I wrote to him and I said, "You got their names wrong." And that happens a lot, right? It does, because like they don't speak Russian, there's mix-up in translation. And yeah, like you're very aware of the fact that not just is it maybe the worst day of their lives, and you want to get that snap, but also that you then get to bugger off out of all that hell and go back to your nice home where there isn't hell. And they don't at all. They don't have that option, and you feel guilty about that. I think you could overdo it, right? You can't do your job if you just go around racked with guilt all the time, because that's not really going to work. But having a bit of empathy and holding back sometimes, I think, was what I did, because I felt I had to.
Did you deal with government officials at all? Because, I mean, what stands out in the book is the human stories of people talking about how they get through the day, to be honest, if they're lucky. But how about the government and those kind of officialdom? Were they helpful too?
They were helpful. You have to get accreditation. There are certain rules. The rules are quite reasonable, like don't publish the location of a strike because it helps the Russians to correct their fire. I'm not, I accept that. I don't think that's particularly heavy censorship. They were by and large helpful, but also by and large I kind of avoided them by going around with Pen Ukraine or with like friends who volunteered in the army. And I had accreditation. I wasn't lying about who I was, but because I was with them, it wouldn't be the sort of drama of like if a whole truck of Western journalists turned up and you'd have to process all the paperwork and check what they were doing. It was more kind of, oh, she's here, I'm fine, yeah. Which was a nice way to travel around, because you get under the skin a bit more, I think.
We saw the children coming out of that picture when you were talking about them walking over that pontoon or whatever it was. I was very conscious when I read the book. I was thinking about how children in this country were affected by COVID, which was very bad, and they weren't able to socialize, and they weren't at school, and they might get sick. All those things times 100 are happening over there. How did you feel that? Did you see that? Did you see the parents or grandparents sometimes who were with them must be very, very alarmed at the thought, because they know what happened in the past in Ukraine. They'll know their history. And they're looking at these kids and thinking something about their future, aren't they?
Yeah, sure. I think it was a real dilemma for a lot of people I spoke to about whether they would tell the kids what was happening. Like a lot of them, if they were kind of 4 or under, they'd just say, oh, we're going on a holiday, we're going on an adventure. But kids know, they pick up on stuff, and usually they'd had to leave their husbands behind. So the kids would be asking where dad was and can we go and see him. And there was a lot of women putting on a very, very brave face so that they wouldn't fall apart in front of their little children.
Do you think a lot of them have gone back? I mean, Germany, I know, took a lot, Poland and so on, but in Berlin, for example, I know people who were working as volunteers, and they've said some of them have gone back, and some of them also have to go back because they have to go back to renew their passports, I think. Yeah.
I think a lot of people have gone back. I mean, Kharkiv's a city of 1.4 million. When I got there late April 22, I think there was 300,000 left, and now it's gone back up to 1 million. And that's Kharkiv.
Wow. That's, as you saw, in the front almost in the front line.
Yeah. But, it's just about doable. And that's all people want, really, is to... I've never had to leave my home, so I cannot imagine existing in exile like that and not knowing where you're going to go. So, to get home was everything for people.
Did people say to you what they hope journalism could do? In other words, what they hope from the West? Because I know some people feel very let down, or at least grudgingly supported.
They should feel let down, I find this really overwhelming because you're in it. I mean, I've never covered another war, and so it's not like you're in a country where pretty much everyone wants you to be there, and it's really lovely. I mean, it's not like if it was a different situation, say it was a civil war, and you don't know who's around the corner, who might be a danger, who might kidnap you. It's not like that. I mean, the main threat is coming from the sky, which is, you can take that in your stride. Whereas everyone you meet, are just like, oh, it's great that you're here. Which, including soldiers, like I was telling you about being on a base in Kurakova, near to the power station they just destroyed. And because it was a quiet day, and I was with a friend who's a volunteer bringing them all these, she brought them like an ambulance. I mean, how she got these things, I don't know. So we drove down, and they prepared this like massive feast, it was like they got a chicken and they'd smoked it, and they got fish in the lake, and they'd been getting mushrooms and lots of horilka, which is like Ukrainian vodka. It was not what I was expecting in Donbass. But they were just really pleased that we were there, partly for the company and partly for it's important. Yeah, everyone knows that it's important to have Western journalists there, that you need to keep telling these stories. Yeah.
I want to throw open to questions from the audience in just a minute, but the other thing that struck me about this was the sense that they may feel let down, which we touched on a little bit there, by Western governments. Is that something that's quite... Is that something they talk about? Do they think, oh, if you report this, then maybe somebody in your government or somewhere will take notice?
They used to.
Well, that's a different story, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, obviously, like, I have limited powers, me and the Sunday Post, to persuade governments to do things. But no, it's about persuading the population and then them persuading their own governments, and it is crucial in that. But yeah, I think people had a lot more hope in the power of opinion, and that the promises they were given would actually be stuck to, and they just haven't been. They haven't been at all. And there's a real sense of cynicism and being abandoned in Ukraine.
Did you get, from your various visits, though, did you get a sense of a different mood, or is it a different mood depending on, obviously Odesa is very different from being on that Eastern Front. Mm-hmm. But do you think things have changed? Do you think there's more, because you're going to go back as well, aren't you? Do you think people are very, very worried that the reality is people in the West are just not that interested?
Yes. I think particularly there's a lot of anger about Germany and Schultz, and I think that's quite reasonable to be angry about that situation. Mm-hmm. But no, I mean, it's not like they're saying, oh, you should come and sort this out. They're just saying, give us the tools that we need. Like no one that I met was saying you should have boots on the ground now. But, at least give us, like, the weapons that you promised and let us use them. I mean, my God, how long was that? Imagine you're in Kharkiv and they're bombing you day and night with glide bombs now, these sort of horrific thing to throw into the center of a city. The blast radius is like 800 meters. And the airfield that those glide bombs come from is just across the border, just a skip and a hop. And you've been given weapons that could directly hit that airfield and prevent the next one from coming. And you are not allowed to use them in case it upsets Putin for his, let me count now, 30th red line. Yeah, and that was shameful, personally. Yeah.
We're going to get on to, I'll open it to some questions and we'll get on to a bit about what you might do when you go back next. But let's have some questions from the audience. So who'd like to start us? Gentleman at the front, and if you just put your hand up. Anybody else over there? Oh, you got one there, and the gentleman at the front too. Yeah, there's fine, yeah. Okay. I'll come to you in a second. Go ahead, sir. He's got the microphone.
Yeah. Thank you very much indeed. My name's Ewan Grant. I used to work in Ukraine for the EU Border Assistance Mission, which was based in Odesa, although I was based in Kyiv. Your words about the failings of the West really need to be heard by everyone here, because frankly, I saw behaviour that was absolutely disgraceful, and I hope Mr. Essler and his colleagues at the BBC can eventually call out Baroness Catherine Ashton for her time at the EU. But my question is, on a hopefully more positive note, who is listening to you, who isn't, and who can we perhaps urge people to book you up to hear what you're going to say and link in to your messaging, because your messaging is badly needed. Thank you.
Thank you. Jen?
Oh, thank you. I'm not the only one saying it, Who's not listening? Well, I come from the left. I am on the left. I always will be on the left. And there are sections of the left which have gone completely insane. And I really struggle. At least now I know who the Stalinists are. That's useful. But it's just been extraordinary to hear. I mean, I thought I would see what people were posting, and I thought, well, when I come back, I can talk to them, and they've known me for years, and they'll believe me. No, they believe Chomsky. So the number of conversations I've had that just are people saying, well, this is NATO's fault, this is NATO's fault, is extraordinary. Totally, totally extraordinary. And you just hope that people can... Because in one sense, this war is really simple. It's really, really simple to understand. It's pure aggression. It's imperialism. It was an invasion. It's also about fascism and democracy and brutality. On the other hand, it's also complex. There's a long history of colonialism going back and back and back. And that's psychologically complex, it's historically complex. And what I wanted to do with the book is to explain that backstory in a way that would be easy to understand and easy to read, because it's through people and places and street names and, you know, me bumbling around. And the hope being that I can win that argument, or I can persuade people of this argument, but without sort of hectoring them and making them read a history book. So I say, obviously, encourage people to read the book. Thanks.
Gentleman at the front there. Thank you.
Thank you, Jen. A wonderful talk. You'll have read in the papers, like all of us, about the slightly changing views that are coming out of Ukraine in terms of how the war may be settled, including land. A big question, I think, for Ukraine. Having taken the train from Moldova, Chisinau, down to Odesa a few years ago, passing Transnistria on the way, you can see the difference. Odesa is a wonderful, wonderful city. There's no doubt about that. Mm-hmm. And it's important to Ukraine with the port and so on. How do you see this talk of land being taken by the Russians as part of the settlement? How do you see it playing out? Have you got a view on that?
Yeah, I think it was not misreported, badly reported yesterday, because Zelensky, I mean, it wasn't him saying to Sky News, we're going to give over the land, you know, and he kept like, this has been talked about for a long time. What he's saying is, we'll get it back at some point. Because now, I mean, Crimea's been in Russian hands for a long time. They've also deported it and got rid of a lot of Ukrainians and filled it for the Russians, and that's a really difficult situation, and I don't know what the future will be for Crimea. I really, really don't. I would obviously support Ukraine in their right to retain their land back to the 1991 borders, as anybody who believes in rule of law should. But the same for bits of Donetsk and Luhansk that have been occupied for a long time. The thing that we have to bear in mind, though, Putin's position, as of, I think as it still stands from June 24 this year, is completely maximalist. His position is that he wants all of Kherson Oblast, so take Kherson back, now that they've pummeled it into dust with all the drones and the safari of people, and Zaporizhia, which they have never taken. Like, that's their position. Nobody's going to accept that. Nobody's going to hand over 300, 400,000 people to live under Russian occupation when we've seen the mass graves and the torture chambers and the execute. We know what they do in occupation. So I don't see how any government, any society could thole that. And also they don't trust Putin. They don't trust his word at all, as nor I think they should. So no, I don't think... It's very easy for us in the West, isn't it, to sit and say, oh, hasn't it gone on a bit long? Do you know, like after the counter-offensive, the second counter-offensive that was so hyped up and just always doomed, there was no way that they could break through those Russian positions, especially with their hands tied behind their back, no permission to use the long range, and not enough ammo. And then it did fail, and everyone started doing that. Oh, isn't it been a bit long? Isn't it time that you know? I mean, that's honestly one of the most morally appalling things I've seen in the whole of this sad tale was that. So. Yeah, I mean, of course the war will end in negotiations, but they need leverage. They need leverage, which is why they took Kursk, and I still think that was probably a sensible thing to do.
Some more thoughts? Yes, gentleman at the back, gentleman there. Any of the ladies in the audience like to ask a question?
Do you think of yourself, or maybe in the future you might think of yourself as a war correspondent? Or is that a weird question? I don't know.
I did again, Reef Orkney. Is that an Orcadian accent I hear? Good. Gosh, sorry, what a terrible insult I've just given you. No, I don't. I mean, I like covering war. It suits me. I don't know why. It just does for some people. But I wouldn't... I think part of like why I like being in Ukraine is because I know the history. I've been studying it a long time, and I speak the language, and I can do the kind of context and the deeper stories and the features that dig into things. Whereas if I went to like the Middle East, I wouldn't speak the languages, I wouldn't have that background knowledge, and I'd just be there kind of parachuting in, which is totally fine. I'm not saying that people shouldn't parachute in, they should. But I wouldn't get a lot of satisfaction out of it. So I don't know.
Thank you. Gentleman there, and lady over there, and a gentleman there.
Just on that, the kind of idea of parachuting in, I listened to this really good podcast series, and it was called Pig Iron. It was about this kind of freelance journalist who had gone to the DRC to cover a civil war. And it effectively, you know, he had been in Crimea in 2014, had parachuted in, and in the end, he gets killed in the DRC. He is completely overwhelmed in a situation that he really doesn't know anything about. And without, in any way having to compare your own plight to that of the people that you're covering. Surely you must have had doubts. This is an incredibly dangerous situation. And even if you are versed in the history of it and the language, there's still like at any moment an interaction could go wrong. So why was that not enough to stop you, and why are you motivated to go back still?
Yeah, that's a very, very reasonable question. I really kind of fought with myself over whether I should go to Ukraine. It was obviously, as I said, some people really thought I shouldn't. And obviously it's like putting people who love me in a lot of worry and pain. And I didn't want to wade in as like, you know, the person who doesn't know what they're doing and puts other people in danger just because she wants to be in a war zone. I didn't want to be that guy, because that guy's a bit of a, well, I won't swear. And I wanted to get the training, and I wanted to get body armor, and these things are just really hard to get. They're really expensive. There's very few funds for freelancers, and that's a problem because with budgets just being slashed left and right, it's often freelancers who are going to do this work. I think when I say parachute in, I'm actually thinking of like staff journalists who have the backing, who have, you know, they're being parachuted, right? And that's a very different, that is a very different thing, because you have, well, insurance for one thing, which we usually don't. So yeah, I mean, like, realistically, I was always going to go because Ukraine's a very big country. Odesa wasn't too dangerous at first, and then, as I say, sort of go on to different places. But it's what I'd wanted to do all my life, and I spoke the language, and I wasn't going to sit on the border forever, and I certainly was not going to go home. But yeah, I did grapple with it a lot, and I didn't do any frontline reporting until I'd done the training, which was September 2022. I did the 3-day HEFAT training because I got a grant from the Rody Peck Trust, who help freelancers, fund freelancers. But they're very strict that you have to have been doing this for quite a while, you have to be an experienced journalist, and well, they should. Because now I get a lot of students saying to me, oh, I want to do what you do, and I'm like, go and work in a local paper. And it's just like, it's so not what they want to hear, right? They really don't want to hear that.
The Dundee Courier's pretty tough, I hear.
No, it is, yeah. Yeah, the experience is really essential. The experience of being a journalist, right? Of being ethical as well, and like being trained in how to treat people well and not exploit them, I think is important.
Yes, the lady there.
Hello, thank you very much. I really enjoyed listening to you. I was in Kiev in 1985 for 3 months, and I remember standing under the Ark of Unity between Ukraine and Russia, a great big metal semicircle, with a friend there saying, I believe in our lifetimes you'll be able to come to the West, thinking in our 50s maybe. Anyway, 2 years later he was free and he was able to come to the West. And the irony is that, of course, now, in our late 50s and early 60s, it's all gone wrong again. But I just wondered if you knew if that Ark of Unity was still there, and if not, when it came down.
Whereabouts was it?
I think it was near Bulgakov's birthplace.
I'm sure it'll have come down, or be renamed or something.
Yeah. And I suppose I'm also interested in, as you say, all the shifting loyalties of people who would have had some loyalty to Russia and Ukraine, and the time when they were able to stop feeling loyal to Russia, whether it preceded the actual invasion, or I don't know if you have anything to say around that.
I don't know if it's loyalty to Russia. It's more like people are nostalgic for a time when they weren't desperately poor. And this is the same thing in Russia. Like, the narrative still being, oh, you know, when the wall came down, we tried to give them capitalism, but they were too corrupt. That's still what we say about Russia, and it's an outrageous thing to say. We fleeced that country, we robbed it dry, and that creates a lot of the humiliation and anger that is driving this, you know, the stuff behind this war, that kind of make Russia great again stuff. It's still very, very painful. And the same with, I remember people saying, oh, well, you know, this is all very well, but in the Soviet Union, like, we had a nursery school for my kid, it was right there, and there's lots of things that were very wrong about that situation in many different ways, and there were lots of things that were good, like housing, and I hope we can, you know, people seem to struggle to have like a nuanced like understanding of things, but yeah, some of that's just rational. And it was a nice idea that there could be a great union of different people. It was always a lie, you know, realistically, it was always a Russian imperial. Well, I mean, maybe like until 1920, if you want to get nitpicky about Lenin, but like that was always behind the project. And you see this in, I mean, this is what's all been kind of painfully uncovered and figured out in Kharkiv, especially because Kharkiv was the capital of the Ukrainian SSR. And briefly, there was the policy of Ukrainizatsiya, where Ukrainian newspapers and poets and playwrights were encouraged to write in their native language. They did this in lots of countries, like Georgia as well. It was like the Bolsheviks trying to get everyone on side because everyone hated them. And then Stalin, reversed it and killed them all. I mean, literally killed all the poets in that one building where they housed them all. And that generation, they call it the executed Renaissance, has a huge impact on now, like, the cultural idea of Ukraine, on writers today, and also was like this thing to say, look what they've always been like. And that's all being kind of hashed out and thrashed out, and it's extraordinary to be in the middle of it. Yeah.
What do you, we've just got a couple of minutes left. I think people would be interested to know if you've got a plan for going back, or are you winging it, or how planned are you now?
I just remembered that I should reapply for accreditation. So
I'll go with winging it then. But
Yeah.
I mean, it will be you'll be going back just before the inauguration of Donald Trump.
Yes.
The world is, I know, but it may be a very difficult period, and we've already heard that from Zelensky. He's been quite diplomatic, but he's clearly
He's
very
having
worried.
to say nice things about a very bad man, which must suck, But yeah, look, I mean, no one actually knows what Trump's going to do. It's completely unpredictable. So anything could happen. The front could collapse. That's feasible. It's slightly falling apart in the east, and they've lost land in Kursk. I don't know what's going to happen. So I really, really want to be there, reporting on it, obviously.
Because the other side of it is, it can't be going very well for the Russians if they need to ship in at least 10,000 troops from North Korea. In other words, this is a war of, this is a war of serious attrition on both sides. But the difference I would suggest is that for Putin, one of the ways dictators fail is if they lose a war. That's how dictators
Absolutely.
fail.
It is the best hope for Russia. People aren't going to rise up and overthrow that dictator. Look what they did to people in Belarus when they tried. Look what they did to those people in Belarus, to so many, or tens of thousands of them. Like the brutality. I've met so many people from Belarus who were fighting in Ukraine.
Oh, really?
They can never go home.
Right.
They'll never be able to go home as long as that man's in power, but they're doing it for their own freedom as well as...
As long as Lukashenko is in power in Belarus.
Yeah, it's extraordinary. Look, I mean, the main disadvantage, they have a lot more men to throw into the meat grinder, and their tactic, the Russians will use a tactic of throwing wave after wave after wave of, these conscripts or prisoners or North Koreans now or Yemeni guys, and the Ukrainians have to just gun them down. Can you imagine what that does to you, having to mow down wave upon wave of human beings in front of you, and their comrades are just climbing over them because they're not allowed to turn back? And the Ukrainians won't do that to their guys, and so therefore they're at a disadvantage.
Right. And it is. I saw recently, and I hadn't really thought about this, that in terms of conscription, if you're 18 to 28, I think, you don't have to, you're not, or 26 perhaps it is, you're not necessarily conscripted, but it's over that. So in other words, the younger generation, this is not how we would do it in Britain, as you well know. We do exactly the opposite way.
We go straight for the 16-year-olds here, don't we?
16-year-olds, but I mean, that's interesting because for all sorts of reasons, but one of them is they're clearly thinking about the future. If you were saying the youngest people are not going to go straight away into the front line, that's a very, very bold thing to do for a society.
They have lowered the conscription age. It was really controversial.
Have they?
Yeah, look, they're all out of options. Like, what are they meant to do? There's not enough people. I remember someone saying to me, all the people who want to be in the army, they joined up straight away. And now we're getting the people who don't want to be in the army, and we really don't want those guys. Right. They're not going to do well. Right. So yeah, it's a huge problem.
And just as a final thought, have you got a kind of rough idea of what you want to do? Do you want to go to the front line? Do you want to be in where the politics are? Because there's going to be a lot.
No, because they're just hanging around outside some hotel, hoping that the mayor or Zelensky will come out. And I'm so short, I can never get my hands up. And no, I hate that stuff. It's so boring. No, let's go back to Kharkiv and hopefully Kramatorsk if it's still there. Yeah.
Well, the best of luck, and I really, really can't recommend this book too much. And it will be on sale. I think you'll be signing outside. It is terrific. I'm very, very pleased that you also won the Saltire. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thanks, Jen.
Cheers.